Hello, everyone, and welcome to National Credit Management's webinar, How Different Generations Require Different Collection Techniques. My name is Karen Reddick, Vice President of Business Development with NCM. NCM is a collection agency that services colleges and universities nationwide. We service exclusively campus-based funds. As we all know, we are working with many different types of students from many different generations, and it's important to know how to communicate and deal with each of our students. Therefore, it's crucial that we understand each generation they come from. David Glezerman, our expert panelist, will walk us through these generations and how to adapt different collection techniques to each one. Before we get started and introduce our panel, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping tips. Now, since this is a recorded session, we will not be taking questions, obviously, during the session. However, I will be sending out an email along with a link asking folks for any questions they had during listening to the webinar link. If you do have any questions, please feel free to email me directly. I'll have a date when I would like to get the questions returned so I can go ahead and feed them to David and Carrie if needed. So thank you for that and your participation today. Before we go ahead and introduce our panel, I again want to thank you for joining us, and this is a very, very important topic that I get asked all the time. In fact, a client the other day asked me, how do you deal with these millennials? What kind of techniques can I use in collections? I said, well, timing's everything because we're having a webinar, and we look forward to hearing that from David, millennials and all other generations as well. Let's talk a little bit about David. David's the Assistant Vice President and Bursar at Temple University, where he has been employed since 1986. He has an overall responsibility for billing collections and management of student finances. Mr. Glezerman has worked in higher education receivable for 39 years. He's a nationally renowned speaker who has presented at many industry conferences and workshops. He has worked with National Association of College and University Business Officers, NACUBO, as a faculty and program committee member for numerous conferences and author of several articles and books. The founding chair of NACUBO, Student Financial Services Council, David was also awarded the Association's initial Student Financial Service Award in March in 2008. He's previously received the Association's Professional Development Award in 2010. He is the co-author of Managing and Collecting Student Receivables, published in June 2016, and Managing and Collecting Student Accounts and Loans, a desk reference for educational receivable stewardship. He has written numerous articles for and is often cited in numerous higher education and collection industry publications for his views on student loans and educational debt. Recently, he has authored Collecting from Different Generations for the March 2018 issue of Collector magazine, and Not All Student Loans Are Created Equal for the August 2018 issue. Glezerman also is certified instructor for ACA International, Association of Credit and Collection Professionals. He's a past recipient of ACA Member of the Year, Charles F. Lindemann Instructor of the Year, and Fred Gershner Award. Glezerman has also earned ACA Master Credit Executive designation. He currently serves as a member of both the Association's Creditors Committee and its Council of Delegates governing body. He's a graduate of Rutgers University, received his MBA in Human Resource Management from Temple University. I've had the pleasure of knowing David for almost 20 years now. I not only consider him a colleague, a mentor, but also a friend. So, David, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone.
We also have joining David, as well as an expert panel as well, is NCM's Vice President of Collections, Carrie Guile.
Good afternoon.
Carrie's been with us for 11 years. Interesting is Carrie's experience. Prior to joining NCM, Carrie actually had many, many years of experience managing a contract for the Department of Education for student loan collections. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, David, and tell us a little bit how different generations require different collection techniques.
Well, thank you again, Karen, and welcome to everybody. We're going to flip to our first slide and talk about who the different generations are, because there are unique ways of having to deal with the different generations. When it comes to collecting debts, again, strategies are different. It's not necessarily one size fits all anymore. The needs of individuals, if you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy, different generations are at different stages in their lives, in their lifestyles, and how they want to communicate and be communicated with. If we look at the 5 generations here, the silent generation really are students' grandparents or older, in terms of education debt, we don't see them very often. They may be payers for some of our students, but that's really about it. And that's probably all we're going to talk about them in today's webinar. Many of us, like myself, are baby boomers, again, born after World War II up into the early 60s. I kind of look at World War II, the Beatles, for the baby boomers. We're the generation that has parented some of the others we see out there, particularly millennials, some of the Gen Xers, but we're also the generation that has been through college or has been working for years. We'll talk a little bit about strategies there because a lot of cases, these are the parents of the students that we deal with. Gen X, again, post-Beatles and through the late 70s from being born, many of these are college students, graduated, moving on through life into the workforce right now. We're really the generation started incurring the type of student loan debt we've been hearing about. When we talk about $1.5 trillion in student loan debt, not counting what it costs in tuition and fees at our campuses. The most familiar term, I think, would be millennials or Generation Y. Again, this is the group born in the 80s and up through the mid-90s. You hear a lot about the millennial generation. It's almost, when you talk generations and collecting debt, the focus usually is on the millennials. Some of our most recent students, graduates, the generation that has literally in all types of debt, $1.1 trillion just in the millennial generation. The millennials are also unique because right now, just a study that just came out in the last week or so, done by Principal Financial Group. In their survey, 94% of millennials that were surveyed plan on making some type of a financial resolution in 2019. And I think what was interesting when they looked at some of their spending habits, we'll talk more about this later, but food was probably more than half of the budget busters for the millennial population. And once we get past the millennials, we're now into Generation Z. Again, this is the group born in the mid-90s and some of our younger children coming out of that generation. These are the students coming into college, and they're starting the college experience, having similar issues with debt, management of finances. This is a group right now that's very heavily targeted in our financial wellness or literacy initiatives. Let's go to our next slide, please. We're going to ask you a quick poll question. And again, we're not surveying you because we're recording today, but put yourself in the category which generation you're a member. And don't be surprised if there are a lot of baby boomers, even a lot of Gen Z folks in the audience today. What we do spans all the generations on our campuses, and what we strive for, again, is understanding the various differences. And Carrie, I know you're talking about, we talk about students and we talk about resolving debt. The generational differences in the workplace are coming more into light every day now, too.
Yeah, that's where, kind of growing up, I'm a Gen Xer myself. I'll go ahead and volunteer that. I'm squarely a couple of Gen Xers here. But yeah, like growing up, it was like our parents' generation, the baby boomers were the generation where you got out of school and you went to work for a company for your career, whereas in Gen X, we grew up in that age of mergers and acquisitions, hostile takeovers and layoffs, and very much kind of the generation where you're going to have 6 or 7 career changes in your life or job switches. And even further now with the millennial workforce entering the workforce, now they're less likely to even have a full-time job. They're more likely to have 2 different side hustles. So it's just very different how they look at work and through the generations.
Good point.
It's funny, Carrie, we've gone from the extreme of a career to job hustles, just within maybe 30-year difference.
Yeah, true. Yeah, from a career to a job hopper to a job side hustle. Yeah.
So let's go to our next slide and talk a little bit about baby boomers. Again, these are the parents that we tend to deal with, whether they're helicopter, snowplow, or tank parents. These are a lot of the people we deal with. And these are a lot of our payers for basic tuition and fees. Whether or not the students are responsible, we go through all the financial responsibility agreements. We try and educate the students on managing their money. And yet how many times do we run into the situation where my parents pay the bill, or you got to talk to my parents? And here's a group you're talking to. You're dealing with the me generation. Remember, we're talking about coming out of the 60s. It was all about me. And that me has now led to an extreme loyalty to their children. Again, the apron strings can run thousands of miles. If you take that into context, this is where the helicopter parents were created. These are the folks that maybe have a harder time letting go, but it's their loyalty that's keeping them close at hand. The mindset of a baby boomer: we'll pay later, we'll get the money, but we won't buy now. We need to buy now. We want the most, because money equates to status in the baby boomer generation. One thing I'll say too, as we go through these characteristics, you can't paint every single individual in a generation with some of these characteristics. It's a mistake to try and just broad brush everybody and say this is the way everybody is. So I need to say that that's probably my legal disclaimer for today. The baby boomers are the individuals that were beginning to acquire the skills and technology. This is, when you talked about ease and mobile device to a baby boomer, maybe a laptop as opposed to a desktop. Thinking in terms, again, this is where they came from. And baby boomers generally were never great with finances. I think, good is an interesting way to describe it, but again, the buy now, pay later mindset leads to potential problems with people's credit, and this is where it starts. One of the things we run into with later generations: where do you get your financial skills as young people? And you think about parents are setting the example. If baby boomer parents are having financial troubles, don't know how to manage their money, what are today's generation seeing? Are they going to their peers for information versus relying on their parents? And then what were their parents' experiences? So let's go from baby boomers into Gen X. Gen X was the first generation where the economy and individuals are not doing as well financially as their parents. I mean, since World War II, we've seen the upticks in the economy, occasional slips and slides, but for the most part, people were doing very well. Their finances improved as years went on. Gen Xers are the first group that have seen that upward trend level off, or even in some cases start to slide a bit. Gen Xers, though, are a generation where they're highly educated. This is where you begin to see more of the student loan debt being incurred because they're focused on going to college, getting an education, building a career. They also are very technologically literate. This is the group that can go from the desktop to the laptop and say, we can do this better. Gen X is a group that works to live. Work is a necessity to be able to live the lifestyle that he or she wants, because money's the means to that end. The one thing we begin to see in Generation X, though, we talk about individuals' attention spans. You can laugh. You're watching a TV show, and what used to be 2 minutes of 2 60-second commercials, you now cram in 8 15-second commercials because people's attention spans are shorter and the need to engage quickly. Think of this in the collection world, getting your message out. You can try and explain every nuance and detail of, here's the student loan debt, or here's the tuition debt that you owe to XYZ university. What does that mean? Because if you're trying to get into a line-by-line description, you've lost that individual probably in the first 20 to 30 seconds. So short, to the point, get your message out there. Let's talk about millennials next. Again, the millennial generation, more sheltered, the rise of the helicopter parents. I could say the takeoff of the helicopter parents. This is where we have, again, the close ties. This is a generation that's tied very closely to mom and dad and to all the gadgets, a very tech-savvy and probably the most educated generation out there. Think about when you're doing customer service, when you're dealing with a millennial population. Immediacy comes right to the forefront. I need my answer now. I need to know right now. And if I can't get you on the phone, I'm sending you an email. And I'm not sending you an email, I'm sending you a text. And I'll do all these within 3 to 5 minutes of each other because you're just, person I'm trying to reach is just sitting at a desk with their feet up, waiting for me to ask my question or get my information. And that's the mindset. It's immediacy.
Yeah, David, that leads a lot to this generation, the millennials, are a lot more prone to use alternative finances, things like payday loans, auto title loans, much more so than previous generations that were much more cautious of that sort of thing. We're seeing a rise in payday loans and a lot of alternative financing.
And now, Terry,
the now goes to the now concept.
And you talk about educational debt. I'm glad you raised payday loans as an example. I need to pay my tuition, so I'm going to go get a payday loan because that's the only alternative I have. From our perspective, we're getting paid. From that individual's perspective, they're now taking out a loan that maybe has what kind of interest? It could be 20, 30.
Sometimes
to be 100%.
Double. Yeah.
Yeah.
And because that immediacy of now, the lack of knowledge in the credit markets, and you put all that together, they're earning to spend on one hand, but when they need now, they want now, and they're not necessarily focused on the end result. They're paying back a payday loan. You're paying much more interest than you'd ever pay back on your student loans or even credit cards. And this is why millennials have really reached a record. They owe, I've talked about that $1.1 trillion. There are concerns in the marketplace right now that millennials' debt levels are really creating a drag on the economy. You think about this. This is a population that may not be able to buy a house, to buy a car. How many times are young people dating, and they're checking out their credit scores and they're checking out each other's student loan debt and trying to make a decision whether they're going to do more than hook up and whether they're going to marry, raise a family. And these are decisions that are all being deferred because of their debt levels. And
is that part of the Tinder profile? I don't know.
Could be credit score.
I would not be surprised if somewhere out there you're going to find that, because again, how many times are decisions being made, and you're looking at high six-figure debt combined, even on an individual basis. If the national average is running about $35,000 to $40,000 just for an undergraduate degree, and the pressures in society are you need an advanced degree, or if you're going into a profession like law or medicine, you're well into six-figure debt. Marry somebody you meet in medical school who's also going to be in a specialty. Combined, they could easily have $500,000 in student loan debt, let alone buying a house, having a mortgage, trying to raise a family, and you put all these pieces together, something doesn't play out in the long run. From our perspectives, again, this is a population, when we're talking about their student loan debt, this is a population you try and move toward loan consolidation because, again, while we're talking about a very educated population, the complexities of student loan repayment potentially create situations that maybe the best decisions aren't being made. Let's say if you consolidate all your federal student loans and you go into an income contingent or an income-based repayment, and you're not working, like you were saying, Carrie, you've got a couple of side hustles as opposed to one full-time job with benefits, put all the pieces together, it's going to be tough to try and stay with a standard regular 10-year repayment, but you need to be, pieces need to come together. This is where it's really important. Millennials are really the generation, I think, where we need to, even if these are graduates of our institutions, this is where the value-added services for alumni come into play when it comes to financial wellness and literacy and pushing out information. Because I think now, especially in the world of collections, we've gone more from a demand-based talk-off into an educating talk-off, because we've got to try and help our consumers. And I use the word consumers interchangeably with students, parents, borrowers, etc. I think we need to educate consumers, one, on the value of repayment, second, more importantly, on the importance of repayment and timely repayment, and three, what the impact is going to be on them, not just today or tomorrow, but at least for the next 7 years, that something could be on their credit record, if not for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and we notice in the credit reports through the generations, if you look at a baby boomer's credit report, you're going to see the biggest portion weighted towards their mortgage, then probably second would be car payments, whereas the millennials, you may see a mortgage, but you're more likely to see heavy credit card debt. And then with the millennials, you see very few installment loans and usually large sums of student loan debt. So there's definitely a shift in the credit report across the generations as well.
And Carrie, the other thing that comes into play when you talk, starting with the millennial generation, and it's getting better with millennials, was their ability to save. The fact that we run into situations where you'll talk to a millennial consumer and they say, I don't have money. There's nothing put aside for the proverbial rainy day. And I think what we tend to run into in those situations are, you're now, going back to what you said, you're looking at alternatives in the marketplace. They may be payday loans because you've got parents, the same helicopter parent that wanted to keep you under their wings for umpteen years are now moving into retirement and don't necessarily have the assets themselves to help out their millennial or Gen Y or even the Gen X students. And what you run into now is that situation with no savings. All the things that you want to do and have a lifestyle, again, are put on hold. So when you talk about basic budget blunders for millennials, the Principal Financial Survey, the budget busters, I've mentioned dining out, buying food and groceries, clothing or apparel, entertainment and vehicles were the top budget busters. They were not even getting to the student loan piece here, but this is where expenses are being paid, so that paying debt now becomes even more critical and more problematic. Some of the financial resolutions that the millennial generation survey we're talking about was one that almost half now want to find a way to save money each month. A little smaller, 4 in 10 now want to talk more and think about reducing spending. If you're spending too much, this is what I like in terms of budgeting. We could teach budgeting and say if you have $100,000 and you're spending $120,000, unlike government or federal or state governments, you can't overspend. It doesn't work. Reality is you can't spend more than you earn. If you ever, you either have to pick up a side gig or you've got to cut your expenses. Credit card debt, because that becomes an alternative when you don't have the cash. It's another way of deferring your purchase. That's got to be paid at some point. And don't think the credit card companies are any nicer than colleges and universities in that respect. This is business. At some point, that debt's going to come back and hurt, and you're paying a higher interest rate for the most part. So, these are all areas that the millennials surveyed by Principal are now saying these are things they want to change in 2019, because It's going to lead to a better lifestyle, and it's a way to move forward and get out of debt. Let's jump to our next slide, and we can talk a little bit about some of the differences in generations. I want to go back, and again, we're not focusing much on Gen Y or Gen Z here. I think you can take the millennials, bring that down into the next level, and you still get that sense that similar characteristics. The Gen Z population, I think we look at, they're going to be coming out of, they're either going into or just beginning to come out of college. They're getting more financial literacy training, not necessarily in elementary or secondary schools, but when we get into colleges and universities, you're seeing more states that are requiring financial literacy training in one shape or form. You're seeing several states now that have implemented requirements for student loan debt letters to be issued. Pennsylvania is the fifth state. Pennsylvania just passed the law in October to require all colleges and universities in the state to provide their students with debt letters every year, so they know how much they borrowed and what the implications are. Again, information is power to the latest generations.
Yeah, another thing with the, hey David, another phenomenon with the Gen X is, especially the older end of the Gen X generation, is now they're starting to have to take care of their millennial college students as well as their baby boomer parents, and that puts
welcome to my world.
Right. So there's that additional stress on the Gen X, that portion of the Gen X.
I had two calls yesterday. I had 2 calls yesterday. My son telling me he needed more money in a bank account, and my mom telling me when I'm going to come visit at her assisted living.
Very common. Yeah.
That was yesterday.
Karen, when you visit your mom, does that mean she's write that check?
Yeah, exactly.
I got to tell you, it is so true, because you think about it. You're looking back to helping your children, and now you're helping your parents simultaneously. I mean, when we talk about the issues with debt. If we were having this conversation on the economics of the society today, the costs of healthcare, we haven't even talked about that with the different generations and what the needs are and how much of an impact that's having on both student loan debt and lifestyle changes. It's everything is coming together in such a way. There's concern about the student loan bubble eventually bursting because of the $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. When we start to combine that with the cost of health care, the cost of food, all the way around, I think the concerns are, at what point does this absolutely explode? And I think what we're finding more and more, based on the generation, debt levels are going up. But yet, in some areas, if we were talking about auto financing, you see that's level, maybe going down a bit. Student loan debt's growing faster than the cost of tuition at colleges and universities. So you're seeing borrowing patterns to fill gaps. We talked about some of the budget blunders, per se, with food. How many of our students, I think we're seeing a proliferation of food banks or pantries opening up on college campuses today, because we literally have students that can't afford to eat. I mean, we've never seen anything like that. And that's with higher borrowing. That's with all the support services that are available. But these are the situations we see more and more of now. That's the fear with, Gen Z, for example. The bubble could break. And something will have to give. But back in Gen X, this is where the higher debt levels are kicking in. This is where credit card debt's kicking in. And by living in the moment, do you need if you're living in the city, and I'll say if you're living in St. Louis, downtown, do you really need to buy a car, or can you Uber, Lyft, or walk to most places you want to get to, or take public transportation? Because not only the expense of buying a car, the insurance, the gas, and everything, parking, everything associated with it. borrowing, I mean, how many times do we talk to students that say, you told me I'm eligible for $10,000, so I borrowed every penny, but I only needed $5,000 to pay my bill. And that refund, boy, I really got to do some other things with that. It all comes back to bite in the long run. And again, that's not an indictment on individuals in any generation. It's an indictment that we have to get more knowledge into the generations, into the individuals' heads to understand what the consequences are. Borrowing today is not a one semester or 1 year commitment. It can become a lifetime commitment. You think about high debt levels, you're into paying back your loan for 25 years potentially. What does that do to you? The other side is, when we talk about buying a house, the mortgage crisis that hit back in the recession of 2008, interest rates now are starting to creep up. So anybody who has the resources to buy a house is now going to be paying more there to go with their higher student loan payments if they're not taking steps to consolidate or refinance. All these things coming together create situations that could become catastrophic if there's a real downturn in the economy. Let's go to our next slide and look at look at millennials. We talked about their savings or lack of, although that is getting better and there's more of a focus now on savings because, one of the good rules when we counsel students, first thing you do in budgeting, you pay yourself. So if you're making $1,000, if you're netting $1,000 a week, and you're right there, how many individuals do we talk to that say, I got a job that's paying me $80,000 a year, so I'm going to see a check I'm sorry, I'm showing my baby boomer age here. I'm having money deposited into my checking account for X amount, but it's not what I thought because, they're taking taxes out. And they're taking out all these deductions, so that maybe you're only earning 70% of your gross salary. Right there. If you don't pay yourself in the beginning, you're shortchanging yourself. You're not setting up any type of a savings. When you have a crisis and need the funds, you maybe have the credit card for a while to depend on. But what happens when you max that out? So a lot of what's happening in the millennial generation is the lack of skills in managing money. And that's why finances are such a point of contention. This is the greatest concern millennials have. More than anything, finances are the factor that's creating the most stress in most millennials today. So even a generation that has gotten their degrees, they're educated, is going to be paying for it for years to come. And I think the one survey, this bullet I have here about millennials are more scared of credit card debt than dying is very telling. Carrie, I know you were starting to say something. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just, that's pretty amusing. It's scary, but it's amusing, yeah. But they definitely will have to budget for the tattoos and some other things. But it's definitely, I notice when you're trying to speak with them on the phone, they prefer alternative methods of communication more too. And I think that's one of the interesting things where a Gen X, like you pointed out, wants to get to the point. Millennials sometimes are almost to their own detriment, afraid to come to the phone.
Well, again, I think that part of that is technology has come so far. I mean, again, email is almost a dinosaur technique now when you talk to the younger generations. Texting, Twitter, Facebook. This is how we want to get our communication. More people will use Messenger than think about a regular email, for example, because they're so attuned to that.
And that's what's difficult collections is because we're trying to keep up with the technology, but the legislation is just woefully behind. The FDCPA was clearly written for the baby boomers as it came out in the 70s, and it references postcards and telegrams and collect calls. I don't think too many of the Generation Zs know what a collect call even is. I don't know that they've had that. So
I was going to say when a third of our generations have no landlines, that's telling.
Right.
When the Telephone Consumer Protection Act was enacted, it was designed to control faxes. How many people even use a fax today? And that's
right.
Advanced technology compared to where we were in the 70s with the FDCPA. I mean, that
right.
really puts third-party collectors like NCM behind the eight ball because you're conflicted in communicating with the consumers the way they want to because the compliance restrictions put you at risk that somebody sending a text seen by a spouse or by a significant other then creates a situation where you're going to be accused of an FDCPA violation. Right
and
there.
A lot of that, yeah, and it's done for consumer protection. However, sometimes not getting the information is more detrimental to the consumer. It comes full circle.
No, and I think consumer protection is very broad in the sense that you're trying to preserve rights, but you're not taking into account the legislation is not keeping up with the times or the technology. The technology moves so quickly that it's worse than trying to hit a moving target. At least in a moving target, you can figure out what speed it's at. You don't even know what tomorrow's technological advance is going to be. We go from Twitter to Snapchat, and we don't Instagram somewhere in the middle, and most people are forgetting. They're thinking Snapchat is old technology now. So you really get caught up there. So I think a lot of what happens in terms of the generations, finding the comfort level, and this is where financial responsibility agreements are so important because it preserves not just the consumer's rights and outlines their responsibilities, but it also helps protect our institutions, both first and third party, from accusations and allegations that potentially we spend more time defending when in fact it's to the detriment of consumers themselves. Getting that information out to them in the way that they want, to me, should be optimal. But we could talk about legislation and changing regulations and laws for days. I think the key is trying to understand the differences, trying to understand what our consumers want, and deliver it in the best possible way and bring them to the table. So, we talk a little more about millennials. Let's go back next slide, Gen Z, because I think, again, this is the generation coming up. Same way that we're talking about different means of communications, Gen Zers are tied to their devices. I mean, if you walk on a campus today, how many times are you watching students walk and they're on their devices? Crossing the street. They're putting themselves at risk, but boy, those texts are going out. Gen Zers are even listening to their parents now. There's no longer the pushback and conflict there. They're taking in what their millennial and Gen X and even baby boomer parents are telling them. This is the generation that is trying to learn more. This is where the financial wellness programs we put out there can have benefits, because this is a generation that's much more interested in learning. They want the knowledge about how to manage their money. And again, more sophistication when they're talking about more student loan debt. They really have that much more of an understanding. So let's go to our next slide. And I think, again, just to summarize a bit, one point, some of the younger generations may not have the understanding, the knowledge, the experience with money or credit. I mean, again, we're talking about Gen Zers may be talking to you about, will you accept payment in Bitcoin as opposed to a paper check, as opposed to going online. Many cases where we charge service charges or convenience fees for credit card payments, the idea that there's that extra cost can be going somewhere else. It's not something they necessarily need to do. Where planning will help cut their expenses down. The key element here, too, I think, is the fact that we're growing more financial literacy and wellness programs on our campuses, and it's becoming more visible. One thing I need to say here is we're never going to get 100% acceptance from our students that there's a need for more education in financial literacy or wellness. Studies have shown that most of our younger generations are getting their information either from peers or the internet. Not even their parents are having the most impact. The fear is that the information they're getting online isn't necessarily right. I mean, if you go to Wikipedia, anything you could put on Wikipedia is subject to question, for example. And who knows what your best friend's experience has been with finance. If they learned from their parents who are $1 million in debt, who have poor credit, have credit scores in the 500 range, let's say, and just they can't even get a plus loan, is that going to be the example you want to follow? You really have no idea. So I think it's important, again, from the philosophy of debt collection right now, and Carrie, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this when I finish this statement, I think has turned from that demand payment to more of a counseling model and an education model on all those reasons why it's important to pay and pay today. Are you finding that?
Yeah, very much so. And I love your example of Wikipedia. I actually, not too long ago, had a borrower who was a school teacher and did a little research paper citing Wikipedia, how she calculated how much we paid for her debt and how she would be able to settle it and how much profit we would make. You know, just because it was on Wikipedia, that we must have bought it for 2 cents on the dollar. Therefore, by offering us 5 cents on the dollar, well, we'd be making quite a profit. And not having any understanding that we work on a contingency fee, that we don't own the debt. It was just amusing because it was a very well-written paper, very nice lady, and I just had to, I'm like, but her whole premise was just so completely flawed that I had to take a few minutes to kind of explain that to her, and it worked out well, but it was just, to me, it was amusing to see that, you know, she wrote a school, like an elementary school or a middle school research paper.
So if it's on the internet, you mean it's not always true?
Not always true.
Wow, you just bursted my bubble.
Yes, and then I have to be the bearer of bad news quite often when it comes to, well, I finally paid my account. Why didn't it just disappear from my credit report? And I have to explain to them how it remains as a paid collection item. And so, yeah, much more of the calls I tend to take are much more consultative, counseling, just really explaining the system, how it works. That's one problem that transcends all of generations, is that just not a detailed understanding of how the credit and collection system works. It's easy maybe for us who've been in it for 20 years or 30 years, but if you really aren't in that realm, it can be very, very, very complicated.
Well, I laugh because, you know, talk about credit reporting and the fact, you know, how many times consumers think that by paying their bill, their credit record should be automatically cleansed. I laugh because this is good internet folklore, that there's such a thing as a goodwill adjustment that can be processed. And I actually had somebody write me that and make the request. And it really was well written until they got to the point where it said insert creditor's name here.
Right. So yeah, we see many goodwill adjustment letters coming across on a daily basis, and there's YouTubers out there with videos about how to get a goodwill adjustment, and none of it's true. And And some of it also comes from the mortgage lenders. When they do try to buy a house, the mortgage lenders convince them. Yeah, they'll tell them, oh, call the collection agency, they'll remove it. And it complicates our world because the mortgage person, in their eyes, is the person who's helping them get a house. We're the collection agents. We're the ones keeping them from getting the house. So
right. We're wearing the black hats. Everybody else is wearing the white hats. And again, I think this is one of the fallacies out there.
Yeah.
Something else I wanted to talk about. If we can go to our next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about communications. And still, when we talk about dealing with the baby boomers, again, I thought letters, voicemail, they're still using that to an extent. But there was a survey done earlier in the year by a group called Intelligent Contacts. And consumers were asked how they wanted to be contacted about an unpaid bill. Karen and Carrie, let me ask you this. What percentage do you think preferred a phone call?
Of baby boomers?
This is across the board now.
Across all generations. I'll say 25% want a phone call.
Karen?
I wouldn't say it that high.
Not
I'd
even
say
that high?
maybe 10%.
All right.
Karen, you didn't read the survey, did you?
No.
It's actually 9% preferred a phone call. 43% wanted to be notified by email.
Yeah.
41% preferred a letter, and this must be the younger generation here. 7% wanted to be contacted by text.
Yeah, that number's only going to increase.
Yeah.
And the people who wanted the phone call were basically 55 and over.
Yeah, baby boomers, yeah.
So right there. And a lot of that is because that personal contact, when you get on the phone, you make that right party contact with a consumer, how many times are you dealing with the embarrassment factor? It's the gotcha effect. Now we really have to talk. I can't escape this now. And strategically and psychologically, you're having to work past that to try and to get your debt collected. So you're coming at, you've got to overcome those types of situations when you're dealing person to person like that. So a lot of this, it's easier when you don't have that type of contact, when you can go behind voicemail. And then again, if third parties are impacted because of the phony decision, even what type of a message you can leave. So it's very restrictive in that sense, but yet this is how baby boomers prefer to communicate. We go to our next slide to tell you.
Hey, David, before we get on, can we explain what VOTI is? Because I know some people don't know, but it's really important because this is something that's really is a dilemma in the collection agency business in dealing with students and leaving messages. Carrie, will you kind of give us a little?
Sure, yeah. It was about, I want to say about 12 years ago, a decision was FODI versus NCO. And what really created the dilemma for our industry was that the voicemail did not leave the disclosures, the mini Miranda disclosure, and the courts found that it was a communication, and by the FDCPA needed the mini Miranda. But other cases have cited that if it's an answering machine, it's a third party, and therefore it would be a violation of the FDCPA's third party disclosure clauses. So therefore, if you leave a message without any content like the mini Miranda, then you're being false or misleading, therefore violating the FDCPA. And if you do, you potentially violate third party disclosure. So again, this is where we talked about earlier, is if we're trying to protect consumers, but if they're being blocked from getting the message, then it ultimately hurts consumers because they're not able,
especially for that 9% that want to get that message.
Yeah, the people who want the message, they suffer because they don't actually get the message because there's not necessarily a safe way to leave a message. I've got a 30-page book from ACA International that's final conclusion at the end of the 29th page is that there's no safe way to leave a voicemail.
So you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't.
But it's a good read.
And we know that the CFPB, whatever they're called these days, they're looking at updating the debt collection laws, and hopefully they give us some guidance on that. Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump to our next slide. Let's give you some techniques to talk when you're talking to baby boomers. Again, here, when you can get them, you want to really focus on the issues and the concerns. You want to drill into the repayment options. And again, I stress options. Payment in full is hard enough to get, and now and then you're going to luck out. You're going to get it on the first try. And Carrie, probably that doesn't happen as much as we might think.
Right. Yeah, we have to be more flexible than that for sure.
So we're again reinforcing that need for good credit, and I think what I call the payment tree. You want to give them options on how to pay. It could be, it may be credit card. It may be post-dated checks. And again, post-dated checks create their own set of legal issues in today's world. If they don't have the money themselves, who can they borrow from? Having options, repayment options, is not just limited to I'll take $25 every 2 weeks. It's how do I get that money? And tax season's coming up, so as people are paying their taxes next year, if they're getting refunds, golden opportunity. If people are working, they're getting a refund, they're going to have that, I call it discretionary income, but they're going to have that one-time spike where they'll have an ability to pay. So placing accounts at a time like this, for example, as things pan out over the next couple months, big opportunity to be able to collect payment in full or larger down payments on accounts. Let's go to our next slide, and we can talk a little bit about, just again, keeping in mind baby boomers. We've talked about being the parents or grandparents of our students. A lot of them are living through their children today. They're the repayers of debt. And again, we've used some of the terms in terms of helicopter, snowplow, tank parents. Take your choice, in the air, on the ground. Those of us on the east or west coast, maybe they're going to be coming in. I don't know what we would call them, if they're raft parents, but I don't think they're letting anybody hang out there these days. So let's jump to the next slide and talk about Gen X for a second. This is the group that's going to question you on everything. Carrie, I'm guessing that when you're dealing with collection calls, this is the group that disputes their balances more than anybody else. You've got to go through verification. You've got to validate. And, under the FDCPA, when you get that dispute, you have a limited amount of time to respond to the consumer. This is probably a group that really will tax you on that. And if you're not being supported by your client and getting information quickly, it puts the account at risk for even being able to be collected, because that's really a necessary step up front. I'm going to let you talk about that in just a second. But I think, again, you're dealing with a group here that's more savvy. They know their rights one way or the other. They're more angry or frustrated that you're in touch with them. In some cases, it's an unhappy group, and they're out because you found them and you want your money. They're going to be out for revenge one way or another. They're the ones that may threaten to sue you over the least little statement that's made. But I wanted to go back to verification, validation, and what the importance is there with this group.
Yeah, to kind of build on that, what I see a lot of times is when the Gen X is the parent of the millennial, and you've just about got the millennial ready to commit to pay, and everything's worked out beautifully, and then the parent who's a Gen Xer comes in and then kind of wants to undo the entire setup, because they want to question it. So sometimes it's not only that they question their own debts or request validity of their own debts. Now they're doing it for their millennial students who are actually somewhat easier to deal with, and they sometimes get involved and can disrupt an arrangement on an account. So in both cases, on their own accounts and on their children's accounts.
Well, let's jump to our next slide, because I want to tell you a little bit about what to expect. You're going to get a dispute more times than not from a Gen Xer. It's just the nature and just what will come into play. Your best defense there is have your ducks in order. Have your documentation. Make sure before you're placing an account, before you're making a call, making a contact, that everything's in order. If financial aid has adjusted the account, that's created the balance, make sure you can pinpoint that and show somebody and eliminate any question about it. That's the best way for you. Having your ducks in a row and having your documentation, you can overcome consumer stalls in that respect. And then the goal for Gen Xers is to move them to a resolution. Stalls can go on and on and on. You can quibble over whether the I is dotted or the T is crossed. You need to move your consumer past that and resolve the outstanding account. Next slide, please. Because we're going to talk
David,
now.
David, real quick, just to interject just a minute. We NCM actually is going to be putting out a validation model of like the ideal cover letter, the ideal statement, the ideal breakdown. So that's something that we were going to roll out hopefully by the end of the year, but early part of first quarter.
That's great, Karen. I think, again, anything that can be done to standardize and streamline makes this much more efficient and helps overcome the stalls that are out there.
Great.
So now with our millennials and Gen Gen Z population, this is a group, again, they have mobile devices. They're using their mobiles to make payments. They're using their mobiles to text. The phone is not the primary reason to have it. It's a different mindset that way. So text, apps. Again, a lot of our institutions have apps to do registration, how they're getting their bills, how they're paying their bills.
Right. This is really the first generation that has their credit report on their phone at all times too. That's a more recent phenomenon.
Credit
now.
Karma?
Yeah, the Credit Karma or other credit monitoring. So that is something that we never really used to deal with, and that is another source of disputed debts now too. Is that they actually have. Used to be you'd have to find out your credit was bad when it was like a surprise when you went to apply for a new car. But now they're just walking around, their phone dings and they saw their credit score went down 20 points and then they're calling in. So that's just a relatively recent phenomenon in that too.
I mean, and it's funny because in that sense, a lot of times we would be viewed as the bad guys because we report to credit reporting agencies now, and even in the sense of their ability to obtain credit, most of the complaints I hear about credit reporting are not, I can't get credit, I can't get preferred credit, I can't get the best interest rate because my score is low, and you reported me and that's driving my score down. That in itself is a major generational change, because it's not even about the debt as much as you're impacting me from maximizing my efficiency in essence. But I think one of the issues with this generation, again, is avoiding those direct conversations. How many times when you actually talk to a consumer, can you resolve an account within a couple of minutes? We're trying to do this back and forth by email, by text, by chat. Just is not going to, you're not getting, messages don't get out the same way. Again, this may be my baby boomer technology, but if you're hiding behind email or other forms of technology, you're not necessarily getting the best information. You're not able to shift gears and find a resolution. You're hung up on, by not having those direct conversations, you create more of a problem in the long run that's exacerbated when there's an easy resolution. I always think of loan consolidation that way. You talk through the process, use the technology to put the app in, get everything resolved, but to know the nuances of income-based repayment versus a standard and what the advantages are. Or if you're a Perkins borrower who could get cancellation for teaching or law enforcement, you may not want to do that, but you'll never know that if you're not having this type of a conversation. You know exactly where to go on a website or an app. So these are the types of things that I think come into play routinely. Let's go to our next slide. Again, we talked about educating the consumer You've heard me talk about counseling. Collaboration's a real key. What we're trying to build here is a win-win. We collect our money, our consumer resolves their situation. That's true collaboration. We find solutions, and that's most of what we do today. So I think this is where it's important to look at options to get consent on alternative communications like texting or email. And again, some people may ask, and Carrie, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this too, about just communicating instead of a quote collection call, I'm sending out a collection email. And even as a first party, with privacy and data security these days, I think it puts people and institutions at risk making their demands through electronic media. But then how do you leverage that if you have to go back to what we were saying earlier about preferred methods of communication? How do we leverage that so we keep everything safe, but we can connect with the consumer?
Yeah, again, it comes down to education. Our borrowers, they prefer to communicate by email, but they have to register their email, and we try to let them know things like, hey, don't email us your credit card, don't email us your social security number. We try to make them read and check the disclaimer box, that they understand all of the risks that are inherent in electronic communication, and to mitigate those risks by following our tips. So we do it more to cover ourselves, but also to protect the students, and we've seen just a greater increase year after year. We just do more and more of our communications through emails, and we've, payment things as simple as payment reminder letters that would just be, some of our students do weekly payments, and we were literally having to send them a new letter reminding them that we're going to take out a payment every week. So cutting down on that paperwork's actually made it a lot better, but they do need to understand the risks that, you don't want to put personal sensitive information in emails, and because emails could never really be totally secure.
Well, part of a healthy financial wellness is protecting your identity. And I think I've always pushed this, and that's something that I'm working on with some of the higher education community, and really implementing financial literacy. Part of financial literacy wellness is protecting themselves against identity theft. Yeah. I mean, we all have to comply with red flags and GLBA and things of that nature, but I think it's important that we educate our students and letting them know how to protect themselves.
Just like a baby boomer to email me his credit card number.
Yeah. Right. Well, my dad, I remember my dad actually writing a bill, putting his social security number on the envelope.
Right.
Years ago, I remember that.
Oh, yeah.
I have a girlfriend who's my age. She had her social security card in her wallet, and I said, "Remove that immediately."
That's lost you.
Well, and I'll tell you, as a baby boomer now that's heading to Medicare, even the Medicare cards don't have a social security number on them anymore.
Yeah.
Because
the military ones don't. Yep.
Too risky. Let's go to our next couple slides. We'll go through very quickly. Some of your motivations for your students, your borrowers in general. Talk about pride, talk about need, doing the right thing. The pride of succeeding, resolving an outstanding debt. The need to do so to maintain good or get good credit, and doing the right thing because most people want to do that. And sometimes they just need to be reminded. We talked about all these ways of communicating with consumers. We go to our next slide, just a couple of cautions I want to talk about. We've been using the word compliance throughout the conversation. Absolutely, from a privacy perspective, from a data security perspective. Whether you're as a first party, college, university, a third party as a collection agency or law firm. FERPA, be aware of what's required in terms of privacy and security. Collection laws, FDCPA, Fair Credit Reporting, Telephone Consumer Protection Act. And many states now have their own laws that you need to be in compliance with. So one of the things, and again, NCM is very good with this, knowing the statutes in various jurisdictions to help you stay out of trouble. Make sure you get good relationships with your attorneys also, because they need to be aware. The laws change routinely. Regulations change. Making sure you've got the right party. Again, one of the issues in social media or use electronic communication, do you have the right individual? And it's not just John Smith Sr. versus Jr., but you look at email addresses. One wrong letter can be sending that email off to somebody you don't even know and creating a privacy breach. And again, security and privacy across the board are absolute standards to be successful. You don't want to be the college or university that's on CNN, Fox, or one of the newspapers in the United States or in your local community for what you have or haven't done. So some things to think about, and we'll just close with these two. Just, you may not be able to go back, but where you're at today is a good place to start. No matter where you're at today, what your goal is, change the ending. Lead yourself to success. And then next slide, when you think about how difficult the job of collecting debt is and trying to maintain a balance between recovering outstanding balances and quality customer service and compliance, you're going to have days that are tough. You're going to have days you just don't want to get up out of bed and not want to go into the office. But overcoming that, that's what's going to define you all in the long run. That's what makes your success. So you never want to quit doing what you're doing. It's so important to our colleges, our universities, our students, their families, and everything that we do. So with that, I want to thank NCM again for having me join you today. I want to thank NCM for its commitment to educating the educators and providing information and professional development to the community. Karen, I'm going to turn it back to you for your last words.
Thank you very much, David. We appreciate your time and your expertise. As always, I always learn something from you. I've heard you many, many, many times over the last 20 years, and I look forward to hearing from you again in the future. I know Nakubo and in future conferences. I'm going to just end it by saying, if you have any questions after hearing this webinar, please email me. I'll have my email obviously in the email I send. Just respond, and I'll funnel those questions through David and Carrie and get those back to you as soon as possible. David, thank you so much for joining us today. Carrie, thank you.
You're welcome.
And we hope to see you soon on the circuit. Thanks, David.
Thank you.